Hey everyone, you're listening to Sacred and Profane Love, a podcast in which philosophers, theologians, and literary critics discuss how literature and poetry can help us think more deeply about love, happiness, and meaning in human life. I am your host, Jennifer Frey. I am an assistant professor of philosophy at the University of South Carolina. You can follow me on social media. I'm on Twitter at Jen Frey, and I'm on Instagram at Professoressa Frey. You can also follow the podcast on Twitter at EudaimoniaPod. In this episode, titled Joseph Conrad's Lord Jim, I speak with National Book Award winner Philip Cly about narrative identity, absurdity, and the difficulties we humans face in our search for the truth. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Hey everyone, welcome back to episode 21 of Sacred and Profane Love. So I'm really pleased to be joined by Phil Cly this evening. Phil is a graduate of Dartmouth College and a veteran of the U.S. Marine Corps. He served in Iraq's Anbar province from January 2007 to February 2008 as a public affairs officer. After being discharged, he received an MFA from Hunter College of the City University of New York. He has a best-selling short story collection titled Redeployment, which won the National Book Award for Fiction in 2014. His writings have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, and the Brookings Institution's Brookings Essay Series. Welcome to the podcast, Phil.
It is wonderful to be on.
So I Twitter know you.
The nice things about Twitter is that it does introduce you to cool people sometimes.
Well, why don't you tell my listeners about your podcast?
Sure. I do it with an old buddy of mine, Jacob Siegel, who's an editor at Tablet, really good journalist and writer. He's got a few fiction short stories out there, which are worth hunting down as well. And we pair a manifesto and a work of art and talk about them both in tandem. And so it's manifesto loosely defined. So it'll be everything from sort of Valerie Solanas' Scum Manifesto, the Society for the Cutting Up of Men, which we paired with Cat Person, Christopher Penny's short story Cat Person.
That was a good episode.
Thank you.
That.
Thank you.
I'm a fan of your podcast.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah. We did a couple of Schiller's Aesthetic Letters and Ian McEwan. We did Alistair McIntyre on patriotism.
Ooh, is that a new one? I don't think I've
heard
that.
No, that's an old one. And the work of art was, we considered the ceremonial interment of the unknown soldier in 1921 as a work of art in its own right, and talked about those two in tandem. So it's an odd project that Jake and I have going that I think is, we did it so that we would have the kind of conversations that we like having, that were sort of fitting with the sorts of things we were writing about, that would kind of feed our work and also just enable us to talk about, ideas and art that we loved. So, or ideas and art that we hated. We don't like everything that we look at, but
That's right. I liked your, you guys had an episode on the First Things Manifesto.
Yeah.
I liked that one.
First Things has been
they're all really mad at me now.
Itself.
But yeah, no, I'm not happy with them this week. So you're a podcaster, and but you're also, you're primarily a writer. Is that how you want to primarily describe yourself?
Primarily a dad at this point.
Yeah.
I feel I don't know if I can claim that, because I know that you've got 6 at home. So 2 and 1 on the way is not that impressive, but
I don't know. It's the plague. I feel like parenting just in general right now is impressive, no matter who's just. So when are y'all due?
In about a month. So
okay, so you're going to have a plague baby.
Plague baby, yeah. That's what we're gonna name him. Baby, just.
Yes. I'm sure he'll be thrilled. You're also in New York City, right?
Yep. No, it's very serious. A friend of ours, um, you know, parent died of this
That's
a
terrible.
couple
I'm
days ago.
sorry.
Another friend um, is in the hospital on a ventilator. Their parent, it's yeah, no, it's terrible.
That's really terrible and terrifying. I'm sorry. I mean, I feel, I'm down here in South Carolina. And so I mean, obviously we have it here. I think we're now up to like 900 cases or something, but it's nothing like New York City. There are fewer people in my state in general than in New York City. I think they're like no one lives here, which I actually like generally, but I'm especially grateful for now. And don't you also have a novel that's like coming out
Oh
or
yeah,
just came
I
out?
should talk about that. No,
Yeah,
missionary.
talk about your novel.
Yeah, it comes out in October. Assuming the world still exists,
Right.
and yeah, it's mostly set in Colombia, though it also takes place in Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, and America. Um,
Which Columbia? Sorry, I live in Columbia, South Carolina, and I'm certain it doesn't take place there.
no, Colombia, the country. Yeah,
Right, gotcha.
and it kind of tracks the way that sort of American wars have cross pollinated. So for easy example, every American ambassador to Colombia post 9/11 has ended up involved in Afghanistan or Pakistan in some way.
Mhm.
Um, Two American ambassadors, they're posting after being the ambassador to Colombia was ambassador to Afghanistan. And then sort of military tactics and strategies that we've used or sort of developed in Iraq and Afghanistan have been brought to bear in the conflict in Colombia. And it sort of follows two Americans, two Colombians, civilians and soldiers whose sort of fates intersect in this one province. So, it's took me 6 years to write.
Wow. When did you start writing fiction?
Oh, I mean, I was always a big reader, which is, I suppose, how the disease starts. And then I found that like the way that could put myself at the most risk, right, and the things that I thought about the world at the most risk, um, whereas the most exposed was by writing fiction, right? I remember writing a story. We were supposed to do a satire in um, my junior year of high school. I went to a Catholic high school called Regis. That
Right. You went to this magical high school. I've heard
you
about it.
you know who went there? Fauci.
You know what? I did know that. I saw that and I was like, of course he went there. It's like,
That's right.
wow.
Yeah, it was a
Wow.
magical place.
Yeah.
And I had written this satire. It was like satire dating or whatever, modern dating among teenagers. Um, uh, and that was pretty sort of, in a veiled way, savagely self-critical and also incredibly profane. And so the teachers all had these, like the teachers had their desks in a big room that the students also sort of congregated in. And so I turned the thing in like a week early because I said, "Oh, I wanted you to look this over. It's kind of, profane."
This is like a short story.
Yeah, yeah, it's a short story, and I wanted to
It's
see
profane how? Like it has a lot of F-bombs, a lot of sex, like what?
all the above. Yeah,
Oh, okay, yeah.
yeah, and I was like, if you could read this, if you don't think it's appropriate to turn in, it's due next week. I'll write a different thing. And then, I go to the back of the room where my friends are hanging out, but the whole time I'm just, sort of freaking out, looking at my teacher as he's reading this thing, and he starts laughing as he's reading it. And then, when he finishes, he calls me over. He's like, "This is great." And he gave me a
Is
hot
this
dog.
like a lay person, a priest?
A
It's a
lay person,
Catholic
yeah.
high school. Yeah.
And it was one of the more satisfying. I mean, it was just one of those moments that was tremendously satisfying. Um,
Did you study fiction
I
at
did,
Dartmouth?
yeah. I studied with the poet Tom Slay, actually, and the poet Cynthia Huntington as well, and a couple other Barbara Dimmick. The Tom Slay, I'm still in touch with Tom. Wonderful, wonderful really interesting poet, actually a poet who spent time in Iraq and actually in a lot of conflict zones, and written really well about some of the complications in telling stories in war zones. So yeah, that was tremendously important. And then, went into the Marine Corps.
So you were a fiction nerd and
Yep.
then you went into the Marine Corps
Yep.
because somehow,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm basically ignorant of your life story, but somehow like my assumption was you went to the Marines and then you got into fiction. But
And then
no.
that made you a writer,
Yeah,
No.
right? Like you're confronted with, death and the absurd and I don't know. You went to a super fancy high school in Manhattan and then you went to Dartmouth. So what are you doing joining the Marines? It's not like an obvious trajectory.
I was raised to believe in service.
Uh-huh.
And that was something.
So you thought it was noble.
And that was something the Jesuits, Regis' sort of unofficial motto is "Men for Others." I was a freshman in college in 2001, graduated in 2005. So when I made the decision to join the Marine Corps, we were already in Afghanistan and heading into Iraq.
Did you think it was a just cause?
No. In retrospect, at the time I did.
No, yeah, at the time.
Yeah, at the time I sort of bought the kind of like sort of humanitarian case for Iraq that was being made among sort of center-left circles, right? The justice of the war was sort of less the point to me than, we were in it. We're going to, whether I thought it was just or not, we were going there. We were already in Afghanistan.
Right.
And how well that we did in those places would be measured in human lives. So, I wanted to serve my country. I wanted to be sort of playing a role in this massive thing that my country was doing that was, going to shape us and as a country and as a world. And I wanted to, do my part.
Right. Did you start writing the stories that make up redeployment while you were there?
So I started the first story. Actually, the first story in the book is the first one that I started writing. And I wrote it a couple months after I started it a couple months after I came back from Iraq. And the first sentence in the book, which is "We shot dogs," is the first sentence that I wrote.
What's your favorite contribution to that collection? Like, what's the one you recommend above all that people read?
Which one of your children is your favorite?
I'm not going to answer that publicly.
So wait, you've definitely got one.
I am not going on record with that one.
The thing is, I conceived of it as a collection. I conceived of it as like I wanted the stories to be read in order. The first one was written first, but the last one was the second one, I think, that I started writing. I knew where I was beginning. I knew where I wanted to end. So they don't, in my mind, they fit together.
Well, if I were minimally together, which I'm not right now, I would, of course, have read your stories in preparation for this podcast, but I haven't read them yet. I actually struggled with Lord Jim. Which, of course, is what we're going to be talking about on this episode. One of the things that we're obviously going to talk about is its narrative structure. It's complicated.
It's complicated, not always successful narrative structure. I think it's fair to say that there's a part in the sort of late middle where you can tell there's in the author's note, he actually starts defending himself against charges that the novel had gotten away from him.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong. This is one of my favorite books. This is one of my favorite books. But there are flaws.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's not. I mean, the thing is, well, the Joseph Conrad that most of us have read is Heart of Darkness, and it's so tight, and there's like not a wasted breath, and it's almost like poetry. So this is a really different vibe, but I think for me, I've just been so distracted and I was like struggling to even follow the plot because it's like, it jumps around in time and then you're like, oh wait, it's not even the same. Like who's narrating this thing? What's going on? But let's just step back for a second. And so now I just want to ask you, why did you pick a Conrad novel, and why of all the Conrad novels did you pick Lord Jim to talk about with me?
I love Conrad.
I do too. Why is he so great? Let's try to put that into words.
You think about somebody like George Eliot, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who will describe a character in their social setting, in their milieu, with such intelligence and sensitivity and just utter perfection. You have these characters who just feel like you know everything about them. You understand them and you understand the world. And that kind of style of narration moves in kind of like the naturalist as you're moving up towards Conrad in time with a bunch of writers. I'm thinking like McTeague from Frank Norris or Stephen Crane, for whom like you got like 19th century positivism and these ideas of sort of science as being able to pin down everything, including the human. And so they're looking at society, and they'll describe human beings in these ways that are sort of really rich and interesting, but also sometimes you feel like the human beings in their works are sort of like, pinned like butterflies to a board, right, and dissected. And when you read Conrad, he has all of that sort of rich understanding of the ways that the sort of sociological conditions inform people and the extent to which we are really, really dependent upon culture and society and those around us and the groups that we're with and the settings that we're in. And yet the characters are free. They're human beings. There are gaps. There are things that he's always pushing you towards, where that sort of confident, sort of positivist inflected sort of ability to pin somebody down with utter perfection, where he'll just prick it and they'll pop like a bubble. Actually, there's a good example of this early on, and maybe this will give you sort of an idea of what I'm talking about. But the first part of the novel is about this guy Jim, who, I suppose we should say spoilers, but he's on this ship called the Patna, and because of a sort of absurd sequence of events, he does something shameful, right? Though it's very clear that almost anybody, and he'd always imagined himself as the kind of person who would do something heroic, and was sort of had these fantasies of when the moment came, he would show his stuff.
Well, yeah, he's out on the scene to like have great adventures and be a hero.
Yeah, he's a romantic. And then when the time comes, he fails. But the reason that he fails is because sort of fate has conspired so cruelly and so bizarrely that almost anybody would have. And he is then, there's a sort of trial of sorts with other seamen who have to uphold the sort of code of the seamen, because the crew of the Patna, which it seemed like it had been about to sink, had all fled, leaving their passengers on board, including Jim. Though, his circumstances were somewhat different from the others. And one of the people running this trial is this guy Brierly, who is interrogating Jim, and it's his job to represent the code of the seamen that Jim has violated and punish him, essentially. And Marlowe, the narrator, is describing Brierly. I haven't the slightest doubt he considered himself vastly my superior. He did not despise me for anything I could help, for anything I was, don't you know? I was a negligible quantity simply because I was not the fortunate man of the earth, not Montague Brierly in command of the Osa, not the owner of an inscribed gold chronometer and of silver-mounted binoculars testifying to the excellence of my seamanship and my indomitable pluck, not possessed of an acute sense of my merits and my rewards, besides the love and worship of a black retriever, the most wonderful of its kind. For never was such a man thus loved by a dog. And I'll skip a little bit ahead. He talks about, like, even despite the fact that this guy didn't think Marlowe was up to snuff, he liked him. I've never defined to myself this attraction to Brierly, but there were moments when I envied him. The sting of life could do no more to his complacent soul than the scratch of a pin to the smooth face of a rock. This was enviable. As I looked at him, flanking on one side the unassuming pale-faced magistrate who presided at the inquiry, his self-satisfaction presented to me and to the world a surface as hard as granite. He committed suicide very soon after. You read something like that, and you're in the world of this different style of narration where a character is just being totally described and kind of hemmed in by everything about them, so you feel like you have this perfect understanding. And then, with no warning, with this utter swerve, he destroys it. And then you sort of come to realize that what had happened with Brierly was encountering Jim. This is a guy who had every success, who believed himself sort of worthy of every honor that he'd received, has encountered a case in which it becomes clear to him that he doesn't, I think there's a sort of mystery to it, but you sort of assume that Brierly realizes, I've never been tested like this, right? And it destroys him. And I
destroys Brierly.
It just, yeah, destroys Brierly. And so I think that's one of the things that I really like about Conrad. I like the way that he uses narrative, right? There's just an incredible, I mean, the way that he narrates, especially the first sort of third of the book when he's going through the Patna story, where he's going from these different narrators and you're getting these different points of view. And with the different points of view, you're getting sort of different kind of ideologically informed systems for understanding this one event, right? That it takes you about 100 pages to get revealed exactly what happened. As he's sort of moving forward in the narrative, he's kind of excavating all the attempts that human beings make at hemming the world in and making it more intelligible and less mysterious. And then they sort of there's always a gap. It always fails.
Right.
That's what I love about Conrad.
Right. Well, yeah. So I'm coming at sort of literature generally from a slightly different perspective, probably less formal in the sense that, like, I'm a philosopher. And so part of my interest in literature is what I think it can show us that philosophy cannot. So it's like, so I'm super committed to the idea that literature is like a truth-seeking enterprise.
I once, with a bunch of students, had lunch with Grace Paley.
Uh-huh.
And when she talked about revisions, she said, I don't revise to make a story better. I revise to make it more true.
Right. Yeah. So I'm really invested in that conception of literature, which I'm aware is controversial, but it's just one that I endorse.
Me too.
And I feel like there's a venerable tradition behind me there. I fell in love with Conrad in high school. Of course, in high school, I was reading Heart of Darkness, which sort of blew my mind. I just don't think I had ever read anything that dark before. And I loved it. I totally loved it. One thing to say about Conrad is English is his third language.
Yeah.
And so I stand in awe at his command of it. He has like a really deep insight into human nature and the human condition. And in all of his novels or novellas, he's like trying to get at some aspect of it, is sort of salient. And it strikes me in my limited capacity as reader of Lord Jim this time around, one of the main things that he's on about in this novel is one, that human beings want to know what's true. Like they want to get an account for themselves, for others. They want to have like a story about themselves, and how hard and complicated it is actually to know what really happened.
I think he would say that wanting to know what's true and having a story about it are two different things, right?
I mean, unless we have an agenda, unless we're trying to falsify things for some reason, right? We're trying to give a faithful account. But I think, and even when we try to tell the story of our own lives, in some sense, we're trying to give a faithful account, but like it's a really fraught enterprise, it turns out. Self-knowledge is really hard. But I think one of the
Yeah.
things about
I was
Lord.
bound to him in the name of that doubt, which is the inseparable part of our knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, I think self-knowledge is part of the issue here. I have this little quote here. No man ever understands quite his own artful dodges to escape
Yeah,
from the grim shadow of self-knowledge.
yeah,
Like that's
it's
one of the
great.
best lines in the whole book. Even further than that in Lord Jim, there's a real difficulty about saying like who Jim is even from an external perspective.
The way that it's told in the novel is in these like it starts out in like in a third person perspective where you get that kind of traditional depiction of Jim and who he had been beforehand, um, and then it switches to Marlowe as a narrator, and it's the first novel I believe that he was writing in Marlowe's voice. Starts telling the story and getting accounts from other people, and then having encounters with Jim, and there's this Patna incident, which is sort of the talk of the town, but which it takes about 100 pages to fully reveal what exactly happened. And basically, Jim, who was this kind of romantic guy who joined, gone off into the seas in order to have adventure, who'd always believed himself to be a courageous sort, and was also, and Conrad makes this very clear, he was the kind of guy who, just by looking at him, you knew this was the kind of guy you could trust, Like just by looking at him, he just was one of those solid dudes who you sort of felt like in a moment of crisis, I could count on him, right?
Well, there's this common line, right? He's one of us.
He's one of us. That's the other thing. Yeah, he's one of us. What that us means sort of sometimes shifts depending on where it's said. And Jim gets on this boat, which is captained by a loathsome fat German captain and like a drunken first mate, and it's a pilgrim ship of pilgrims going to Mecca, and it hits something in the water. The hull is breached, and then it seems very clear that the sort of interior is going to collapse at any moment, and everybody's going to die. It's just a matter of time, right? Mm-hmm. There's nothing anybody can do, and all the other crewmen start to flee, and Jim doesn't feel like that's right. He shouldn't do that. There's a whole crew on board. He avoids it, but then the ship doesn't sink. It just keeps sort of on for minute after minute after minute. And they know the slightest breeze is going to knock that thing down. It's going to fall when when it sinks. It's just going to sink like a stone, and everybody's going to be dead. But he has to stand there watching them try and get one of the life rafts aboard. There aren't enough life rafts for everybody. They're trying to get this boat aboard. They're like comically bad at it. He describes it as this burlesque where he's just watching, sort of torturous, because they're doing the thing that theoretically, if he had enough time, could save his life, but he loathes them. They have no interest in him. And then at the last moment, one of the guys who was supposed to go on the boat has like a stroke or a heart attack and dies. And then Jim looks down and jumps, and so escapes on the boat. And then the Patna somehow miraculously doesn't sink. Mm-hmm. And this was based on a real incident. Mm-hmm. And so the crew has fled, and the Patna just kind of keeps floating along until
it's rescued.
It's right? Rescued by like a French ship, and there's this French guy officer who goes on board for like the 30 hours that it takes to tow it. 30 hours with no wine, which was a nice touch.
Yeah.
This sort of honorable French officer. And when they get to shore, the fact that they behaved abominably is sort of common knowledge. There has to be a trial. But all the people most responsible, the captain, and the others, they all leave. Like they escape. The captain finds like some extra clothing. The only clothing that he's able to find are like orange and green striped pajamas. Um, and they disappear. And then Jim is the only one who actually like stays for the trial to stand up and take his punishment.
That's right. He has to face the music.
Right. He has to face the music. A lot of the novel deals with the sort of the thing that haunts Marlowe, who's telling the story, who's clearly obsessed by the story, is that this sort of idea of like you think you know who you are, right? And then there are things that can happen that can crush that are still it's not that Jim was right to jump, right? Um, and it's not that the sort of seamen who convene were wrong to punish Jim, right? It seems to me that the perspective of the novel, or the perspective of Marlowe, seems to be there's a sort of code that you have to uphold. That code is a kind of creation of human beings. It's valuable, it's meaningful, but it is sort of, in some ways, false or not adequate to all of reality, which is always going to be more chaotic than any kind of system that you can put on top of it. And yet, nevertheless, you're going to need to live your life by some sort of code or meaning of purpose.
It strikes me that one of the persistent themes of the novel is this idea that a catastrophe, some kind of unexpected catastrophe, is like a truth revealing thing. And in particular, what a catastrophe does is reveal your character to yourself and others. And in Jim's case, you know, he's this romantic. He sort of reads these adventure stories about the sea as a kid, and he's like, oh, I'm going to go out there and prove my stuff. And then when it comes time to do that, he's not virile and manly and brave. He's a coward who abandons, but he abandons basically a bunch of pilgrims seeking salvation. And it's this, I mean, you know, it's a kind of crisis, but then he's also the one that is left with the weight of the responsibility of this failure. And I think that like somehow this has to be part of the broader theme of like, you know, what it takes really to get at the truth. Sometimes it takes a lot of external pressure, and sometimes the truth is actually like pretty unpleasant. You think that you want to do this like manly stuff, but it turns out actually you don't. Or you think it's going to be this way because you read about it and it seems so awesome. Somehow it reminds me of Madame Bovary. Is sort of like she thinks, like she reads all these stories, you know, as a young girl, like I think that like romantic love is going to be this way, right? And then it's, wow, it's really not. There's something about catastrophe here that's really important to Conrad. And part of it is that you never know when a catastrophe is coming, right? And you never really know who you are until like you can have all kinds of you can have a fantastic imagination about what you would do in a catastrophe and what it would be like, but you don't actually know until the catastrophe hits. And then sometimes it's like really surprising.
The novel doesn't seem to it doesn't want to hang Jim by how he behaves in that moment, right? Because you talked about this notion of like the catastrophe, and then you sort of see, you know, what stuff we're made of, right? And yet, Marlowe, the reason I think that Marlowe is terrified by Jim, or not, is so drawn to him, is because he's one of us, right? Because he doesn't necessarily think this has revealed Jim's character so much as this is a sort of thing that any of us can fall into, right? We can be Brierly, right? And have the perfect life and succeed in every test that is thrown before us. And yet you never get to master your fate. So there's a kind of later in the novel. So after this, the first part of the novel, Jim goes on to this other, is kind of floats through um, different port towns, right? And then eventually Marlowe helps him find a job in this very sort of remote area where he is able to sort of achieve a degree of respect, and he behaves bravely, and um, and almost sort of masters his fate. And there's this sort of continual refrain towards the latter part of the book about how, you know, Marlowe thought that he had indeed mastered his fate, right? That sort of fate was, you know, this sort of belief that maybe if you have the right character, the character could be destiny. If your character is good enough, you could actually sort of avert catastrophe, or not necessarily even catastrophe, but avert shame, right? And that is ultimately not up to Jim.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, for maybe obvious reason, I'm always thinking of Aristotle. And so Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics in Book 8, it's in a discussion of friendship. And of course, all of the Nicomachean Ethics is about what it takes to be happy. Everybody wants to be happy. Like, that's the goal. He's like, well, you know, actually, you might have all that it takes, and it's just all going to go to hell. And his example is King Priam. So he's like, you know, Priam was a great man, and he had everything that you could want, and look what happened to him. And that's just something that can happen. So that is sort of Aristotle signaling that there's a bit of luck here. I don't know how Aristotle feels about it, but in his discussion, there's no hint that like King Priam went down in shame. I mean, maybe he does think that. I mean, it's certainly a very plausible reading that he would have died, you know, feeling deeply ashamed. This is like the stuff of Greek tragedy, right? It's not really up to us in the end, and it might go to hell, and, you know, that's just the way it is for the human. I don't know. Maybe Lord Jim, is it tragic? Is this a tragic novel?
Um, no, it doesn't. It doesn't feel that way to me. Though the narrator insists that sort of Jim succeeded at the end, um, in a way. Jim is, it's an interesting character to base a novel around, because I think Conrad's less interested in Jim at the end of the day than with sort of what Jim's story reveals, right? That
What does Jim's story reveal?
different things to everybody who encounters him, right? So, you know, some people look at Jim and say, you know, there's one guy who's like, you got to see a thing as it is, and that means like rob, cheat, steal, like life is chaos. Um, there's, uh, you know, Marlowe, who is sort of, I think, captivated and terrified by Jim's story. There's Stein. Maybe we should talk about Stein for a little bit, because he's
Sure.
fascinating.
Who's Stein?
So Stein is this character in the middle of the novel. So Jim has been like sort of working as like a selling ships that come in. He goes and meets them and sort of sells them goods on behalf of whatever merchant is hiring him at the time, and he'll stay in a town until people realize who he is and what his story was, and then he'll flee again. And so Marlowe goes to Stein, who's been in the region for a long time, is this sort of like trader who has a kind of philosophical bent and is really into butterflies, and has, you know, been in really dramatic and dangerous situations, and has a, you know, sort of different perspective on life, and asks him for help. And Marlowe explains Jim's story to Stein, and Stein has sympathy for Jim. And this probably, I think, probably the most famous part of the novel is where he's talking to Stein about this, and Stein says, "Yeah, very funny this terrible thing is. A man that is born falls into a dream like a man who falls into the sea. If he tries to climb out into the air, as an experienced people endeavor to do, he drowns. Nicht wahr? No, I tell you. The way is to the destructive element submit yourself, and with the exertions of your hands and feet in the water, make the deep, deep sea keep you up. So if you ask me how to be, and yet it is true, in the destructive element immerse." As we were talking about the Tom Slay, the poet, a friend of mine, his mother, when she taught high school students Lord Jim, at the beginning of the school year, she would say, why are you taking this class? So you can read literature better? No, it's so that you can know, as Joseph Conrad said, that in the destructive element you must immerse.
What does that really mean?
What does that mean? I think it means that there must be a degree of embrace of that chaos and acceptance of it, and an acceptance of your limitations, right? That if you try and live, there's a certain degree of contempt that the novel shows for people who have lived their lives safely and who think that they can make strong moral judgments, that they can sit in judgment of people like Jim or Marlowe or Stein without ever having experienced these sorts of things.
There's a wonderful line in the beginning. This is like chapter 1. So I'll just read this because this made me laugh out loud.
Yeah.
So this is just introducing Jim. And at this point, it's kind of just a stereotypical omniscient narrator, right? Let me just tell you about this guy, Jim. So originally he came from a parsonage. Many commanders of fine merchant ships came from these abodes of piety and peace. Jim's father possessed such certain knowledge of the unknowable as made for the righteousness of people in cottages, without disturbing the ease of mind of those whom an unerring providence enables to live in mansions. Just right away, you're like, ooh, he's not really...
Oh, yeah.
He's not messing around here.
Later in the book, he just straight up insults the reader. I mean, technically, it's like Marlowe insulting the people who are listening to the story. But one of the chapters ends with him expressing hesitance about telling the rest of Jim's story. And then he explains the reason. He goes, "Frankly, it is not my words that I mistrust, but your minds. I could be eloquent were I not afraid you fellows had starved your imaginations to feed your bodies. I do not mean to be offensive. It is respectable to have no illusions, and safe, and profitable, and dull."
Right. Yeah. I think this was the fundamental appeal to me, as a teenager with Conrad. It was just this man has no patience for bullshit. He does have this kind of animosity towards the comfortable, the bourgeois, safe bourgeois religion, right? Where Providence allows you to live in a mansion.
Any kind of comfortable ideology of almost any kind, honestly, right? I mean, I love there's a bit in the novel early on where he's talking about Jim, and one of the things he likes about them is he's I liked his appearance. I knew his appearance. He came from the right place. He was one of us, right? And so you can tell, he stood for all the parents of his kind, for men and women by no means clever or amusing, but whose very existence is based upon honest faith and upon instinctive courage. I don't mean military courage or civil courage or any special kind of courage. I just mean that inborn ability to look temptations straight in the face. A readiness unintellectual enough, goodness knows, but without pose. And then he says, an unthinking and blessed stiffness before the outward and inward terrors, before the might of nature, the seductive corruption of men, backed by a faith invulnerable to the strength of facts, to the contagion of example, to the solicitation of ideas. Hang ideas. They are tramps, vagabonds, knocking at the back door of your mind, each taking a little of your substance, each carrying away some crumb of that belief and a few simple notions you must cling to if you want to live decently and would like to die easy.
Yeah, so what's really going on there? I had that passage marked, and I was kind of I don't really know what's going on here. So you tell me.
So I think that throughout he has a distrust of the kind of comfortable bourgeois religion that's represented by Jim's father, right? Who he can never return to, right? Because Jim has shamed himself. He has a respect for the code, I guess, of the code of the sailors. Like he respects it, but he understands it's sort of false, right? It's a kind of broad thing that is never actually going to capture the irreducible human complexity of a human being in a specific embodied situation, right? There's a Robert Penn Warren essay in the C1E Review on Nostromo, where Warren, talking about Conrad, wrote, "The last wisdom is for man to realize that though his values are illusions, the illusion is necessary, is infinitely precious, is the work of his human achievement, and is, in the end, his only truth," right? So, and that is, and so most people can sort of construct an ideological system that justifies them, right? Or that sort of gives them a place in the world, or lets them think they know who they are in the way that Brierley thinks that they know who they are. And then every once in a while, and catastrophe can do this, right? You come upon extremely specific, pressurized situations where those ideological systems that you construct to help you navigate through the world, that you need to construct to help you navigate through the world, don't work. And what you're left with is human choices.
What would it mean for them to work? What are the success conditions?
The success.
I mean, yeah, because like, if you say values are an illusion, but they're also your only truth.
Right.
It's like, well, that just is saying there is no truth because your only truth is an illusion. And I mean, do you think that's really what Conrad is getting at?
But that's what he contrasts in that first bit with the sort of unintellectual, sort of natural instincts that he admires in Jim. So towards the end of the novel, he gives you a kind of like false double of Jim in Brown. So
Brown is a pirate.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes, he is.
Yes.
So Brown has fled. He's afraid of prison, stolen a ship, and he ends up in Patuan, which is where Jim has kind of established himself, where he's with the local girl, where he's got the friendship of like this one chief's son. He has respect. And Brown enters his place and sort of gets into an armed standoff with the locals and with Jim. And Brown kind of torments Jim by trying to argue his case in terms that would sort of like be perfectly calibrated to appeal to Jim. So at one point, he's trying to explain how he ended up in this spot. And Brown says, "I've lived, and so do you, though you talk as if you were one of those people that should have wings so as to go about without touching the dirty earth. Well, it is dirty. I haven't got any wings. I'm here because I was afraid once in my life." Right? Which is, of course, exactly the same reason that Jim is. Mm-hmm. And yet, and Brown even has a sort of behaves on principle, right? Sort of perverse, evil principles.
So he has a pirate's code?
Yeah, he has a pirate's code and a pride in his ethic. And you're clearly meant to be revolted by Brown, and you're meant to admire Jim. And I think for Conrad, words, and I think this is related to the style of narration. I think the reason that he's constantly it's not just that Marlowe is telling us a story, but Marlowe will tell us a story about what Brierley told him, or about what Brown told him, or about what this French captain told him. Or at one point, there's a very interesting bit later in the novel where he narrates the end of Jim's life to one of the people who had listened to the story earlier, and it's clearly like a sort of racist Englishman believer in kind of the white man's burden, who thinks that Jim, by shacking up with a native, has betrayed sort of civilization, right?
Well, because he falls in love
Yes.
with she's like half Malay.
Mm-hmm.
What's her? She's like half native.
Right.
Yeah.
And then you get that guy's words. And so he's constantly showing us these sort of different ways and different codes that the people are using to make sense of their reality. And then instead, and except for Jim himself, who in some ways is just sort of simple. He wants to be the romantic hero that he always thought he was, and yet he always bears this sort of secret shame where he knows in his heart that he can't be.
Can we talk about the absurd? So you sent me this amazing little essay by a woman named Daphne Erdenost Vulcan. It's hard to describe this essay. I mean, I guess ostensibly it's an essay on Bakhtin, but more generally, and for our purposes, it's an essay on this concept of a narrative self, sort of like a philosophical account of the self. Her main question is, does narrative identity liberate or imprison human subjectivity? Mm-hmm. Is individual agency enabled or suppressed by a narrative conception of subjectivity? To what extent can we author ourselves? You know, one of the questions here is a question of self-knowledge. So to what extent is any autobiography like a reliable thing? Can anyone really narrate their own lives on their own, or do we kind of always necessarily have to rely on others to understand ourselves? And she
or
seems
God,
to,
right? So this is like Augustine, you know, the notion where when you really start to inspect what memory and time are, right, that it becomes very clear that to be an intelligent, thinking human soul in time is to be unfinished in some way, right? That
yeah, you're a wayfarer.
Yeah. And that's not
you're on the way.
Just a matter of sort of like a religious thought, right? But also one that sort of yields itself if you really deeply analyze the structure thing. You know, Rowan Williams has a nice bit on Augustine where he talks about how, like, you know, people who complain about the unity of Augustine's Confessions. It's a very weird book.
Right? It's hilarious.
Yeah.
Someone once described Augustine's Confessions this way, and it was perfect. I think this is someone on Twitter. But it's like, oh, you know, for like 10 chapters, it's like, oh, God, why am I so terrible? What's wrong with me? Like, oh, what about time? That's totally weird, right? What's up with time? It's a hard book to figure out, for sure. But it's also obviously in some sense an autobiography. Maybe it's the first autobiography, depending on who you ask. But
this is the bit from Williams. Those who have found the unity of the whole work of Luciff have missed the fact that he is not recording an edifying and coherent life, but performing two different tasks. As he says in Book 10, he's exposing his continuing confusions and irresolutions as an encouragement to others. You don't have to have made a good story for life in order to be a faithful Christian. And he is praying. Purely formally, the whole of the Confessions is a prayer. To work out who I am, I need to be speaking to and listening to God.
Yeah.
And in the Daphne Erdenost Vulcan essay, Bakhtin is looking at this and sort of the authorial consciousness, that sort of very omniscient confident authorial presence, sort of which I was speaking before. That she has a word for it, the transgredient. The hero of the work is just kind of contained in the authorial vision, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then what Bakhtin was looking at Dostoevsky, and Dostoevsky has these characters who sort of speak for themselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
And seem to be speaking against the author, in fact. And that, um, that sort of um, ability of Dostoevsky to have this sort of um, authority that he sees in a certain way, right? Where he's not trying to put this sort of uniform construction that will contain his characters and their ideologies within one overarching sort of framework that will kind of comfortably interpret everything for the reader. That ultimately Bakhtin decided was sort of Dostoevsky's sort of Copernican revolution in narrative, and that move is similar to what Conrad does when he pivots to having Marlowe tell the story and then tell the story of other people telling the story, where you don't necessarily have a last word, but rather everything is put into dialogue with everything else.
Right. Well, sort of what I took away, one of the things I took away from the essay, and just correct me if I'm wrong, is that Bakhtin has this vision of narrative identity as being intersubjective. Like
Yes.
it's so there's a conceptual or a logical priority given to the intersubjective over the subjective.
Yes.
So that like your subjectivity is constructed through intersubjective exchange or transaction or dialogue.
Yep.
Is that right?
Yeah.
I hadn't thought about it as applied to literature.
Right.
I was reading Lord Jim and I'm not in the best frame of mind and I'm like annoyed. I'm like, it's sort of like the first time I read The Brothers Karamazov
Mm-hmm.
and I'm like, oh, it's like an important book, but like why is it so boring? And like why does everybody have like 5 names? Just have a damn name. Just stick to your name. I'm confused. And so I do think it's a novel that is very demanding. It requires a lot of patience. Like you really got to pay attention, which, I mean, obviously, if you're a careful reader of fiction, you got to pay attention. If that's the point, right? I mean, that's important. That's deep. If the point is just that, look, in order to understand like who this guy is and what actually happened and what we're supposed to think about it, you actually have to have a bunch of different perspectives. But look, is that the point? She doesn't take a position, certainly not about this novel. I mean,
No.
it's just all sort of like at a very general philosophical abstract level, but just specifically when applied to Lord Jim, I mean, is that what's going on?
And this novel is the eye the essay is The Eye That Tells Itself by Daphne Erdenas Vulcan. Yeah, I mean, I think that is like one of the things that it's not just that you sort of get to the truth through differing perspectives in that way, but that sort of that's a large part of what makes up human beings, right? Habit, necessity. Do you see the eyes of others? Is something that the French officer who behaves honorably tells him that's, and then the sort of nadir for Jim is not actually the trial necessarily so much as when he's on the boat after having jumped, and it's just him and these other sort of terrible seamen alone. He says, trust a boat on the high seas to bring out the irrational that lurks at the bottom of every thought, sentiment, sensation, emotion, right? I think part of what is terrible for Marlowe about this story is that it suggests to him that what Jim is, or what Jim's life, what to make of Jim's life, is not entirely up to Jim, right?
I mean, sometimes you hear like these like platitudes, like, "Oh, you write your own story," and I'm like, "No, you don't.
Right.
You don't. I mean, you don't." You absolutely do not. That's not to deny your beautiful, wonderful freedom. You are free, but you're free within like a lot of stuff that wasn't up to you, including your nature. Like
Right.
you didn't choose to be human, which actually is incredibly confining and weird, and in some ways kind of terrible. Like it's a wonderful, terrible. But like, if it were up to me, I'd be like, Psh, I want to be an angel.
Yeah.
Really, like the human, geez. It's not totally up to you. I really like the way she put it at one point, is sort of like in a more, she says, we are, to put it briefly, authored, configured by an internalized other in much the same way as a hero is authored by the writer of fictional narratives. That being a way of describing like Bakhtin's insight. And I like that. I think there's something deep and important there.
Yeah.
One of the things that comes out in the essay is this, the problem of self-knowledge in terms of my subjective first-person experience, right? I'm thinking of myself as subject, but I can also sometimes see myself as an object. And it's a bit uncanny, actually, whenever I kind of objectify myself. So, like Walker Percy talks about this a lot. It's a theme in his fiction, but he talks about it in his more philosophical essays, right? Where he's like this uncanny experience of seeing yourself as an object when you like actually see yourself as other people see you. And he's like, it's really actually like pretty horrible and horrifying. And you're like, oh, do I really sound that way? Did I really look that way? It's this kind of like a negotiation, right, between subject and object, and
Right.
like trying to get these two perspectives to come together. And this is my way of like getting back around to the idea of the absurd.
Right.
So like one of the things that you wrote to me in an email was that you think that Conrad's like conception of the absurd is closer to that of Thomas Nagel's.
Yeah.
Rather than Camus. Nagel's conception of the absurd, right, is precisely about the gap between the subjective and the objectives. So like the absurd is basically this. Subjectively speaking, it seems like what happens to me is like super important.
Right.
Right? Because it's me.
We care.
It seems like it
We
really
can't.
matters. Like I really care.
Mhm.
But then from an objective perspective, it's so obviously meaningless. Right? I mean, you're just like a peon, a grain of sand on the beach, a drop of water in the vast ocean. Like, it doesn't matter. So there's like this huge gap. And that's the sense in which your life is absurd.
There's a bit from his essay, which is great. Each of us lives his own life, lives with himself 24 hours a day. What else is he supposed to do? Live someone else's life? Yet humans have the special capacity to step back and survey themselves and the lives to which they are committed with that detached amazement which comes from watching an ant struggle up a heap of sand. Without developing the illusion they are able to escape from their highly specific and idiosyncratic position, they can view it subspecie aeternitas, and the view is at once sobering and comical. And that, to me, is why, we talked a little bit about Camus, and I love Camus. Nagel, in this very sort of, you can sort of see him having a little twinkle in the eye, just like puncturing Camus' bubble. Sort of, and he argues that for Camus, the problem is that the world is, sort of is absurd, right? That the world does not fit itself to human desires. There's a great passage in The Plague about how it's the humanists who die first in a plague, because a plague is not something, within the sort of human frame of mind, humanist frame of mind. And so they don't take the sufficient precautions because it doesn't work inside their worldview. So Camus, not on uniformly good grounds, rejects suicide and the other solutions he regards as escapist. What he recommends is defiance or scorn. We can salvage our dignity, he appears to believe, by shaking a fist at the world, which is deaf to our pleas, and continuing to live in spite of it. This will not make our lives unabsurd, but it will lend them a certain nobility. And then Nagel goes, this seems to me romantic and slightly self-pitying. Our absurdity warrants neither that much distress nor that much defiance. And he goes, I would
It's
argue.
the rebel.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you just have so yeah, so for Camus, the gap is between the way you are constructed
Hmm.
as a human being. So you're a rational thing.
Yeah.
You want things to make sense, and you're confronted with a world that is simply unintelligible,
Right.
right? I mean, who is Camus' hero? It's Sisyphus,
Right.
right? I mean, Sisyphus is engaged in this eternal meaningless,
Right.
completely meaningless activity. But he's, what's the famous line? We must imagine Sisyphus
Right.
happy. Like, and of course, Sisyphus was this guy who was punished by the gods to roll a rock, a really big rock, up a really big hill. And then once he gets to the top, it's just going to go back down and he just has to do it over and
Right.
over again for eternity. That seems really unattractive to a human being. Why? Because humans want to engage in activities that are meaningful, that seem like they have a point or a purpose. And this is like the most purposeless, unfulfilling. There's no consummating moment in
Yeah.
this activity. There's no telos that's ever reached. You're just doing this over and over again. It's like raking the leaves. They're just going to come back. It's terrible. So that's the gap.
Yeah.
It's a different gap.
Even if the world made sense, it still there would be that sense of absurdity, right?
You might actually have, like, from your perspective, a totally meaningful life. Like maybe I don't know, you ended apartheid or something. It seems like you're important, but you didn't. Because, like, objectively speaking, who cares?
Right.
The Hegelian picture is less serious. I mean, Camus is sort of
It's
sometimes comically serious.
yeah.
It's like really super serious.
It's sobering and comical at the same time. Yeah.
And like, whereas for Camus, it's like just kind of funny.
Conrad is actually really funny, right? And really
Yeah.
funny in the dark points. I mean, the episode of the Patna is utterly ridiculous, right? And
Right.
the characters are ridiculous. Um, the the drunken first mate who the doctor examines him and he's like, a tremendous, one of the most incredible specimens I've ever seen, like purely from a medical standpoint,
Mm-hmm.
like
Right.
the captain, his striped pajamas, and the description of them trying to get off the boat is, it's like a Three Stooges routine, right?
Right.
And it's also the great tragedy of Jim's life and utterly harrowing to Marlowe.
I mean, does Conrad think that the human condition is absurd and the best thing we can do is laugh it off?
I don't.
I mean, you don't get that sense, like,
No.
say, at the end of Heart of Darkness.
No. He doesn't think just because it's comical doesn't mean you laugh it off, right? Like you still need to struggle, right? You need to immerse yourself in the destructive element. You need to go out there. You need to challenge yourself. You need to immerse yourself in the destructive element while never once believing that you can actually master it, right? That sort of, if you think like Brierly, you've mastered your fate, you're living in delusion. And yet also, thinking that it's important, not succumbing to the sort of the Browns of the world or Chesters who think that the essential absurdity or of the world or the kind of the ways that sociological conditions can propel us to dishonorable action or somehow justify yourself. You need to struggle. You need to try and behave honorably. You need to, and yet you should be attuned to the comedy of it, I think. And I think understanding the comedy of it and having enough detachment that you can appreciate it will help you move forward.
What does it mean to move forward? What does it mean to, like, let me just ask you this. What does it mean for Conrad to, like, come to self-knowledge? Because, like, I can say pretty confidently for someone like Augustine, to come to self-knowledge
Right.
is to see that you're a sinner, to see that you need God's grace, to see that everything in this life is just a foretaste of something much better, blah, 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 blah.
Right.
You're a needy, dependent thing, but like ultimately your perfection consists in love of God.
Well,
What
there's
is
that
it?
discussion with Monica, right?
Yeah. I mean, what does it really mean for Conrad? Like what are you going to come to see if you come into self-knowledge as a human being? It's not that you're a wayfarer, a pilgrim on his way to salvation. I think that would be like too comfortable for him.
It would be. Yeah.
It's a happy ending in a way.
Yeah. So there's a bit where he argues that sort of self there's like we always evade self. I mean, he's continually arguing that we evade self knowledge, right?
We absolutely evade
Yeah.
self-knowledge.
And there's a wonderful bit where he says, talking about Jim's story, it had the power to drive me out of my conception of existence. Out of that shelter each of us makes for himself to creep under in moments of danger as a tortoise withdraws within its shell. For a moment,
Oh yeah, that's a great
yeah,
passage. That's maybe my favorite
yeah.
one.
For a moment, I had a view of a world that seemed to wear a vast and dismal aspect of disorder, while, in truth, thanks to our unwearied efforts, it is as sunny an arrangement of small conveniences as the mind of man can conceive. But still, it was only a moment. I went back into my shell directly. One must, don't you know? Though I seemed to have lost all my words in the chaos of dark thoughts I had contemplated for a second or two beyond the pale, these came back too very soon. For words also belong to the sheltering conception of light and order, which is our refuge. Conrad has, you know, we're never at rest until we find rest in God. I think the most that you can get in Conrad is you sort of live your life according to that conception that you know is sort of false or insufficient in some way. You you try and hold fast towards those principles that guide you a little closer to truth or beauty or um, whatever it is. It's because he's not a nihilist. He believes that the choices that these people make matter, right? Um, but he thinks that it is ultimately too mysterious, too strange, and ultimately too frightening for us to really hold on to it for any length of time. And in that passage, he suggests that it's ultimately beyond language.
But I think Conrad has a really clear sense of good and evil.
Yeah.
I think that he has a sense of the profound extent to which human beings can be evil. I think he also has a sense of the transcendent,
Mm-hmm.
even though it's not God, right? Um,
We had approached near to absolute truth, which, like beauty itself, floats elusive, obscure, half submerged in the silent, still waters of mystery.
yeah, so right. So their transcendent tracks the old notion of the transcendentals,
Yeah.
right? Truth, beauty, goodness, and things that transcend our subjective perspective, things that we strive imperfectly to get, things that are hard for us to get, things that we're meant in some sense to attain by our nature, things that are real, right? They're not illusions.
Right.
Whereas Heart of Darkness is about how hard it is to hold on to the good. Lord Jim strikes me as more about how hard it is to get at the truth, right? I mean, it's obscure to us. It's shrouded. It's
Yeah.
difficult. Our best efforts sometimes fail. It's confusing. Like we don't really know. And somehow I was thinking like all of that was like baked into like the weird, complicated narrative structure and also kind of the weird ending. I mean, it has kind of a weird ending, but it's also there in Heart of Darkness. I mean, there's a lot of stuff about truth in that book too. I mean, because the end of the story is like a lie.
Yeah.
It ends with a lie,
His last words were
right?
your name.
Yeah,
Right.
which is crazy.
Yeah.
The thing that really attracts me to Conrad, I think his sense of like the limits
Right.
of human beings,
Right.
right? I mean, he's like so aware of how limited we are. Um and And yet, like, we have to strive for something that, like, we're not really set up to get. But, like, you gotta try.
Exactly. Yeah. And you sort of create systems for understanding the world, right? As you move through it, that are necessary, but nevertheless don't actually sort of exhaust the mystery at the heart of existence. And when we try to grapple with another man's intimate need, that we perceive how incomprehensible, wavering, and mystery are the beings that share with us the sight of the stars and the warmth of the sun. It is as if loneliness were a hard and absolute condition of existence. The envelope of flesh and blood on which our eyes are fixed melts before the outstretched hand, and there remains only the capricious, inconsolable, and elusive spirit that no eye can follow, no hand can grasp.
Yeah.
It's nice.
It is nice. So let me ask you, we're going to have to, like, end this soon
Yep.
because it's we've been talking a little while. So what do you think? So it seems like we're all kind of in this for the long haul. It's a little terrifying, actually, to think about how long I'm going to be stuck in my house. I seriously, I can't think about it too much. The way that I'm coping is that I take my life in very discrete, small chunks, 2 days at a time.
That's the way to do it.
That's as best as I can do. What do you recommend for quarantine reading? Besides, obviously, Lord Jim.
Well, there's the Decameron.
Why should we read that? Why is that a good plague reading?
Well, it's set during a plague.
That's Boccaccio,
Yeah.
in case people don't know.
And who doesn't like bawdy tales during a plague?
Yeah.
The Magic Mountain.
Yeah. It's almost fun. Give us, like, a wild card one.
Yeah.
An unexpected one. I'll give one. I think people should read Walker Percy's Love in the Ruins. It's crazy, and it's really long, and it's complicated, and it's a little bit apocalyptic.
Lawrence Joseph, who is a wonderful poet, just came out with a book of poems, selected poems, A Certain Clarity. And I think poetry, especially if you are really, really busy,
Yeah.
It's good to pick up a book of poems because you can always read a poem here and there.
Yeah, exactly. I agree with that. That's very sound advice.
Yeah.
Get off Twitter and read poetry. I need to take my own advice.
Frank Bedard, actually, if you like Conrad, he's an amazing poet, and actually he has a poem where he talks about Augustine. I think it's either Golden State or Confession. I forget which one. Where you have somebody who has, in a way like Conrad, I think, a sense, is attuned to something that you often see in a lot of religious writers, which is a sense of those limitations, a sense of those gaps, a sense of transcendence, and also the sort of failures of human beings, a sense of our physical nature and the constraints of that, the constraints of society. There's just a really wonderful poet. I would recommend Frank Bedard and Lawrence Joseph.
Awesome. Well, this was fun.
This was great. Thank you so much.
Yeah. No, thank you.
It is a thrill. I'm a huge fan of your podcast. Thank you so much for.
Oh, likewise. You have been listening to Sacred and Profane Love, a philosophy and theology podcast that is generously underwritten by the Institute of Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America. You can subscribe to the podcast on SoundCloud or iTunes, and you can also follow us on social media. We're on Twitter at EudaimoniaPod, and we're also on Facebook at Sacred and Profane Love. If you enjoy listening to this podcast, and I hope you do, then you definitely need to leave us a 5-star review on iTunes. Not 4 stars, not 3 stars, but 5 stars. And be sure to let your friends know to check us out as well. Our next episode will feature Professor David McPherson of Creighton University, and he and I will be discussing Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. Until then, stay home and keep reading.